Okay, why don't we get started? I'm sure some folks will trickle in post meetings in the Zoom world, and we will record this as well so folks can check this out after. Quick kind of kickoff about why this is such an interesting topic to me. And so if you'll indulge me to talk about accounting briefly, accounting, co-founder of that business, data platform and BI tool for RevOps teams, really helping RevOps teams get to their most important analytics quickly. I bring up who we are because when we work with a larger company, call it, Series C plus or all the way up to public companies, usually they already have like a data team, folks like Miles, maybe a BI analyst, existing tooling, etc. So the question is like sometimes from folks like, why would you need accounting to do that? We already have like the data team in BI, and if you have a data warehouse in BI, like why would you need another solution here? And I think like the answer is that a centralized data team doesn't work well for RevOps that often. They don't understand the go-to-market context. They move too slowly for RevOps's needs often with their kind of ticketing system and serving other functions. And the source of truth can often break down between kind of like the central data warehouse, CRM, and the like. And so when I met Miles, it was kind of like a melding of the minds. He talks about his visions for go-to-market data teams to solve this. So I'm super excited for him to walk us through kind of the future of data org structure and approach to go-to-market analytics, especially in the age of AI. And so, Miles, it's kind of great to have you here. I appreciate you joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James. Yeah, it's been a while. I've been working in data for almost a decade. In my previous role, I was a data leader at G2.com, which is one of the largest software review sites in the world. Little bit about me. I started my career in data, working in public sector, so within healthcare data, so within the Ministry of Health in Canada, and kind of rose up the ranks there. And then after that, I went into consultancy. So I worked for NTT Data, which is one of the largest data consulting firms in the world. And then after that, then I moved on to G2 and rose up there and became a data leader there. So, but I'm excited to talk today about this because I've been working with GTM teams for a while. So it's something that's kind of close and near and dear to my heart, as well as centralized data teams, because that's kind of my background and what I've been doing in my past. About a month ago, I gave a presentation to a group of data people, around 60 people, around how to structure data teams in the age of AI. So I thought I would take pieces of that and put together some slides on how I think rethinking GTM RevOps analytics in the age of AI and moving them from just a reporting structure to more of data ownership, where they can actually start taking ownership over the data flow process.
I love that.
So,
I think that's so
yeah,
important. Yeah, I'm excited to dig in here and hear more about it.
cool. Yeah. So we have to think like, what are the issues that GTM and RevOps analytics are experiencing, and where do they actually fit in the data flow process? Because by definition of analytics, they're dealing with data. Just how are they dealing with data, and what are the current problems that exist on their teams? So I've outlined five different problems. I'm sure there's a lot more, but these are the top five in my head and from my experience. One is you're dealing with tons of systems. You have to do this kind of juggle balance thing between CRM systems, marketing systems, CSM systems, finance systems. Sometimes you work in event tracking systems like Amplitude or other business intelligence event tracking. And then finally, you deal with like normally a global business intelligence tool where everybody goes for their global answers for self-serve data. So they're caught between this rock and this hard place by first they get the question. Now they need to determine where to get the data to answer that question. And our first instinct as workers within an organization is we do what's in our control. So we find things that are in our control first. And there's always been this blurred line of like who owns these systems and how do we manage these systems and where do we go to for this SME or this subject matter expert. So that's one. The second one is there's technical debt between the systems. Your CRM system could say one thing, and then your Looker or Power BI or Tableau global business intelligence tool says another thing. So there's a mismatch between data, and there's also a mismatch between metric definitions.
Hmm.
Um, so that moves on to number three, where you have high variability of changing metrics. And how do you capture that in one system and also translate it to another system so that everybody's speaking the same language? Um, and with a moving business, it's constantly adjusting. So your metrics will constantly change. Hopefully not, but it's likelihood that they will. So how do you capture that in these systems? The other is reporting and dashboarding. Everybody looks to the centralized data team as kind of like the ones that pull these reports. But at the end of the day, that's not shouldn't be their centralized job. And GTM analytics and RevOps analytics, they focus on how do we deliver these reports as fast as possible. But it's difficult when you have sales, marketing, finance, and RevOps leaders like asking for information, and this team is kind of between a rock and a hard place between systems on how to gather that information effectively. So I call it the whack-a-mole problem because you're trying to find this missing link. And then finally is decision support dependencies. So if you don't have control over things, then you're dependent on other teams to help you get there. A lot of the times I see with GTM RevOps analytics that they are dependent on centralized data teams, which causes a bit of missed SLAs and then also miscommunication, where they play in the game of telephone, where they know what they need from a business context perspective, but they have to translate that to other teams to get that information available to them. So, in my mind, these are the top five issues currently in the GTM RevOps analytics structure.
Yeah, I feel super seen here too, Miles. Like these are the conversations
Yeah.
that we have with folks from just like a discovery and a business problem perspective every day in our sales process and accounting. And I feel like it's probably 90% of companies that we talk to have at least one, usually all of these problems, frankly. It's so pervasive.
Yeah. And it's weird because, like, when you do the hiring for GTM RevOps analytics, you are looking for this hybrid person between business context and also technically gifted for data. It's You're trying to find that sweet spot, but at the end of the day, the hiring that we're doing is more directed towards a business analyst rather than a data analyst.
Yeah.
And we can kind of all agree that as AI becomes super pervasive in our everyday life and work, we can just assume that AI is just going to continue to get better. And if it continues to get better, how are we hiring for the skill fit for these teams?
Hmm.
So if we do want to give these teams ownership over a data flow process, what skills do they need in order to fit that? So in looking at all that and ownership, my question to everyone on the call, and the question that I would ask myself if I was a revenue leader, is what do I actually own? And that's where we get into the data flow process. When we think of data strategy is only as good as your data flow. Every part of your data strategy fits in your data flow process. This is what we call data infrastructure diagram, where we're mapping out our data flow process. It's basically like an assembly line of data and how it flows from one system to the other. And our skill sets of how we hire fits in this. Our objectives on AI and how we're going to integrate it into our systems fits in this. Ownership fits in this. Governance fits in this. Role-based access control, who gets access to what fits in this. But I've outlined it by skill set here. So when we think of centralized analytics or centralized data teams own this entire flow process. They may not own the GTM systems directly, but the data that flows from these GTM systems hits the warehouse at some point, and that's where the centralized data team takes control. The issue with giving out control is that you run the risk of lack of skill set, too many hands in the cookie jar, potential governance nightmare, and people not knowing exactly what to do at what time. As a centralized data team, just because that's my background, these are the roles that we hire for the specific parts of the data flow process. So if we were to give control to GTM RevOps analytics, what will we give them control over? So again, there's that data sprawl with all these systems, but we create data pipelines to pull all that information into our warehouse. Do you have any questions, James, on that?
I do.
Yeah.
This is so good, and I think it makes sense given your background. Diagrams breaks out responsibilities by like the data team. I'm
Yeah.
thinking about you posed a good question about like where can we get RevOps or non-data folks involved. Can
Yeah.
you first kind of like give me a quick digression on like data governance? So if I'm sitting in like the RevOps seat, like I think everyone knows data governance means from like the highest level, but maybe give me like the 1 minute or less version of like why it's so important and how it kind of interacts with like this diagram.
Yeah. So data governance at its core is is not something that it needs to be maintained, but it's basically the six dimensions of data quality and the timeliness of the data, where the data comes from, who owns the data, the cleanliness of the data. There's many factors that go into like the governance framework, but the main core of that framework is the owning of the flow, because then you have responsibilities associated to data custodians, data stewards, these SME experts that are supposed to support this. So when we look at this flow, we really need to understand who owns what and what tooling in the flow process. So right now, in this case, and in a lot of organizations, data is centralized. So we have to look at how a data team is structured and how do we move a data team from being centralized to where they actually are not by themselves in a silo trying to
Hmm.
manage this whole crazy process, but
Hmm.
rather ingrained on other teams so that they can support that team in the ownership process of
Yeah, and
this
I'm
flow.
sure it becomes important to really well define what that role is. And I think you're going to get into that too, so that's
Yeah.
helpful.
So what are the three structures um, of a centralized data or a data team in general? It could include GTM, it could include any data team. Data teams, when you're a small organization, they start off pretty centrally. They do that out of essential nature, where you're not a hybrid organization where data teams live on these marketing, sales, and product teams. To manage and set up your data flow process and data infrastructure, most teams will be centralized. As you grow as an organization and add more employees and to your marketing, your sales, or your product, we can call sales revenue, then you get more requests in and more complaints that the centralized data teams aren't meeting those SLAs required. Then comes the thought of moving to a federated model where you're actually still managed centrally. So all the data people are managed centrally, but the data people actually live on other teams or are a part of those teams and their ceremony meetings so that they can understand the business context of each team's structure. And as that grows and each data person starts learning more about each team, then you can move into something which we call a data mesh structure. A data mesh structure is simply data, the thought of data as a product. So we treat each branch of your organization as a data product producing machine. And in order to do that, these the centralized team is no longer centralized, but these experts move in to become marketing data engineers marketing data analysts, marketing analytical engineers, and they live on these teams and they're managed by a data product manager that helps you produce these data products. And data engineering isn't necessarily considered data engineering anymore. They're considered data platform services. So they provide services wherever these people lack the expertise to come in and help them, essentially.
So let me make sure that I fully grasp this. I'm
Yeah.
going to repeat it back to you. Tell me if I have it right or where I got it wrong, more likely. So centralized, probably the start of a data team. Let's get the foundation in place. Important for everyone to be like a data expert first. Make sure that the kind of flow chart that you showed before is really helpful. Then
Yeah.
we moved to federated. Like, let's once the complaints come in around like teams, aren't moving fast enough for the sales or the marketing org, or they don't understand the business well enough. Like, let's go put like a probably like a go-to-market like BI analyst into each of those teams. Like, most likely get them to be a little bit more of an expert, working directly with teams to get a little bit faster as well.
Yeah.
On the data mesh side, is it just more of a pushing down of like the stacks? You're getting like more technical data folks in with each of the function. Is that kind of like the next evolution here versus just like an analyst level? Did I understand that right?
Yeah. So it's looking at the data flow process of what each of these data or these branches own and saying, okay, well, we don't, in order to own our data flow process, we need a data engineer.
Okay.
In order to own our data flow process, we need an analytical engineer. So you're changing the structure of your analytics teams to marry to the branch that they fall under. So GTM RevOps Analytics may have a GTM data engineer, a GTM data analyst, a GTM analytics engineer. So you're hiring for a different skill set to fit the new organizational structure for your data teams, if that makes sense.
It does. And so the main value then from going from federated to data mesh is just more expertise in how that data flows, better understanding of it, higher fidelity, higher quality outputs.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah,
Cool.
exactly.
Makes sense.
And we consider in a data mesh structure, these are areas that produce data products. So we treat
Yep.
data as a product where in these centralized and federated, we treat data as a service.
Got it. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Do you have a sense, Miles, on how many, are there a lot of orgs out there kind of using the data mesh framework? Is this, hot off the press?
Yeah. Yeah. So Netflix is one of them, and ADP is another example of a data mesh structure. But again, the smaller you are, this also pertains to the size of your organization too.
Yeah.
So ideally, every branch wants their own owners of their data. But if
Yep.
you're a small shop, like that may not be realistic in the beginning. Plus, you're still establishing what your data flow is. So maybe it's more opportunistic for you to continue to have a centralized team.
Yep.
But as you move and as you grow, that becomes more and more unrealistic to help support the other folks in your organization.
Makes sense. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
Helpful.
So that kind of answers the question of how to take ownership and put it somewhere. But then comes the question of metrics aligning where there's one source of truth. So going back to this diagram, the data flow process hits a point where it is the last transformation piece to the puzzle, where data hits this point where it can't be transformed anymore. And this is the business data that everybody consumes. And our business intelligence tools are some of those. But our business intelligence tools themselves don't actually house any data. They're actually driven off of what we call a semantic layer. And a semantic layer, semantic just means meaning. So we call it our meaning layer because it's the portcullis around the castle for data. It is the last hurrah or the last layer that everybody is consuming. And all of your systems, your CRM, CSM, sales, marketing systems, they flow or they should flow eventually to this layer. You could almost consider account aim as your meaning layer in a lot of ways. But in a lot of organizations, they build something called a headless semantic layer. And what it does is it's a single source of truth. It has consistent metrics. It promotes collaboration and governance. So if you're trying to create owners out of your data, this is where they would own. It's flexible, meaning it connects to all your downstream tooling, such as your BI tools. You can put out of the box AI tools on top of it. You can generate APIs from it that you can make into Gen AI applications. But basically, it's your meaning layer, and everything flows from your data flow to this meaning layer. So when they say something broke upstream, what they're really talking or downstream, what they're really talking about is something broke prior to the meaning layer. So when we look at a data problem and something breaks, we're like, okay, where did that happen in the data flow process? In our assembly line, where did this break?
Yeah.
Um, so it's important to talk about the semantic layer because it is that last layer that everybody points their fingers at. You
Is
know,
it fair to kind of call it the source of truth, Miles? Like that's how kind of how we talk about it with accounting is like we're going to bring in your data sources, create that central golden data set, that source of truth for everyone to then act on.
yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. So your golden source of truth is the semantic layer, which should pull from your warehouse, which is the final stage of like transformations, essentially. But the semantic layer, all it is, it's a series of instructions that tell you how to join data together. And it just so happens to connect to multiple tools downstream.
Yep, cool.
So when we look at ownership, if we went into kind of a data mesh structure, moving from centralized teams to federated teams where analysts live on other teams to but managed centrally to the data mesh structure where, okay, now revenue owns data products for revenue. We carve out our data flow process to determine what they actually own. And now that we know what they need to own, we need to hire the skill set that fits our team to manage and own this process. Owning systems is it may not be the GTM team. It may be like, some uh Salesforce admin experts, that work specifically in it. But the data flow from these tools to the downstream reporting is owned by that team.
I'm
Uh,
curious, Miles, if you have a perspective, and sorry if I interrupted you. I'm
yeah,
looking at this schematic and it's super helpful. I'm just thinking of this through like a RevOps lens too.
yeah,
And so I think like go-to-market systems, RevOps teams can definitely own that. They often do. Salesforce admin like might be on that team. BI tools will often see, the savviest RevOps folks that know a little bit of SQL or whatever going in there, maybe not owning it, but writing it as well. I feel like the staging report, like the staging and semantic layer is where I don't see as many RevOps folks, at least outside of
yeah,
accounting, like getting in. What kind of like
yeah,
skill set do you think someone needs to have at like the staging example? Like could
yeah.
RevOps do it, or do you still think it's like a data person by training?
So RevOps themselves, like if they're not data people, they shouldn't be working in here. That's why I said like looking at the GTM analytics or GTM RevOps analytics teams, you want to look at the skill set of those teams. And if your
Yep,
aim is to be in a data mesh structure, they have to own that data flow process and how data reaches from these systems to downstream reporting.
yep,
So when I talk about staging, all I'm talking about is getting the data out of these systems into staging and then transforming that data from staging to reporting in your warehouse. So raw staging and reporting is simply your cloud data warehouse. And the transformations that happen from staging to reporting is basically your systems being piped into staging via API or whatever process that you're doing. And the GTM team looks after that. When we think about the skill sets of like what's needed for warehousing, you think of data engineers and building pipelines to get data somewhere.
yep.
Um, and then when we think of the semantic layer or that meaning layer, We think of analytical engineers, people that modify model files, that create dimensional models, that power reports. Um, and then when we think of BI tools or reporting or out of the box AI that sits on top of your semantic, we think of more like business analysts or, you know, hyper-focused data analysts. This whole process revolves around hiring for that skill set.
Yeah, which is
Uh,
kind of the whole point of like data mesh. And it's like we're embedding these experts into the team. They're just becoming kind of go-to-market experts as part of the job too.
exactly. And if you want to get a little crazy with it, then okay, we have our semantic layer and we have the API that we can use. Maybe we can get this team to have an AI engineer on the team to build out, sales Gen AI products that might be helpful for our teams, or conversational analytics, which is kind of a very hot topic, but conversational analytics plugs into your meaning layer, which is your semantic layer.
Awesome.
Yeah. So what does this look like from a governance perspective? Because we touched on that before. We have our reporting layer and our meaning layer. And in our reporting layer, we have our different schemas, they're called. And basically, schemas house tables. And we define owners, custodians, stewards, and service providers in these schemas. So we can say if something breaks, we go to this group to define what broke and how it got there. The same is true with your meaning layer. You have all these model files, but it's owned, has a custodian, a steward of these model files. So if something needs to be modified, we know who to go to for that. So this is called role-based access control, or RBAC, and it's basically assigning ownership or roles to specific data assets in your data flow assembly line.
I got
Uh,
a question
yeah.
in the chat, Miles. For those not familiar, data owner versus custodian versus steward versus service. Is there a
Yeah.
quick kind of like explanation of those roles?
Yes. Okay. An owner is the responsible party. They're kind of the puck stops with them. I'm using a hockey reference because I'm Canadian, but a
Oh,
puck stops with them. A custodian is kind of the editor. They're the ones, their technical expertise that kind of go in there and they change things. A steward is kind of the monitor. They kind of monitor and QA things, but they can also sometimes have edit access. Um, and a service provider is a person where expertise, a custodian and a steward can't do it. So
hmm.
they need a service provider to come in and be like, hey, this is how you do it. I'm the expert. That's where we go back to our structure of like that data platform as a service rather than
Hmm.
owner. This is kind of where they shine. The same is true with model files. You have a person responsible, you got the technical editor who goes in and changes everything, and then you have the steward who's like the QA person that tells them, "Hey, this broke down or upstream and we need you to modify this." And then the service provider.
Great.
Yeah.
Quick time check, Miles. I think we got 7 or 8 minutes left here. So I have so many questions and comments. I'm gonna hold mine. Just
Okay.
wanted to let you know for pace.
Sounds good. Appreciate it. I'm pretty sure we're getting to the end, but we talked about the centralized teams to federated to data mesh. There's many benefits to doing this. I give an example here of ADP and their data mesh structure. You have shared semantic and metric layers, so everything's consistent across the board and everything's flowing. I just point out the traditional ownership versus purely like the modern day ownership structure. So traditional ownership, one central data team, we know that that creates issues, and then modern ownership. Again, we treat data as a product rather than a service. So the new standard is data as a product. The traditional methods were like you have to submit a ticket to a data engineering team. They create the ETL job. Something broke. We got to fix that. There's no governance. Where in the modern method, you own the entire data flow process and you produce data products from that process.
And when we say data products, Miles, just to be totally clear, it's like, should I think of that as like a data set that can be served up to end users, or what is like product if I think about like the scope?
The scope for data products is holistic, but the main scope for data products is like it is a tangible data asset that is for either your internal or external stakeholders. So it's a data asset at the end of the pipeline, at the end of the flow.
Got it.
Um,
Like
so
semantic layer level, like this report, for
yeah, the
example.
semantic layer level would be considered a data product because it connects to a business intelligence tool, and a business intelligence tool alone isn't a data product. It is a data product because it produces like reports and generates that stuff, but all of the data lives in the semantic.
Yeah,
So technically, the semantic is the data product that's produced.
cool.
And then finally, the shift to conversational analytics. We touched a little bit on this, but um, real-time conversation, natural language, where your AI products sit on top of your semantic layer. Your semantic layer holds all of your data products per se, but it's powered by the Gen AI power is sits on top of it. So the Gen AI could be also considered a data product. And we call it when you have natural language and you can communicate to your semantic or your meaning layer, we call that conversational analytics. So what does that look like at the end of the day if you moved your and enabled your GTM RevOps analytics teams to acquire these new skill sets and own the data flow process? You would have four things. You'd have source of ownership, so you have the all the upstream systems and the data flow, and you set expectations for data quality. Access management, so you control who sees what from your data flow process. Domain data modeling, so basically you own and edit the editing and the availability of the data, so you don't have to rely on centralized teams. And then metrics definitions and governance, you own all the critical metrics definitions, not only the definitions of them, but also the source of truth and maintaining that source of truth in the flow process.
We've seen the data modeling and the metrics governance be such a huge unlock for teams that are kind of using account name to do that as well. To be able to go in there, run calculations deeper than you can do in a Salesforce without having to be super technical, rely on the data team, and then also understand when the metrics are changing based on your business context and go update that source of truth yourself is so valuable.
Yeah, agreed. But I wanted to leave it open for questions at the end. If anybody on the call has any questions, I'm happy to answer that. Or if James, if you have further questions, happy to answer that as well.
Yeah, those on the call, throw them in the Q&A kind of button at the bottom nav bar if you have any questions. One came in from let's say a RevOps person, Miles, around like making this transition to data mesh. Like there's kind of two questions in here. It's one, who should be driving that? Is it typically like a data team that says, okay, it's time to do this? Or is it a RevOps team saying, hey, I'm not getting what I need quick enough? So that's the first question. And the second question is like how quick can this change like happen?
Yeah. It's, I like to describe it as an evolutionary process.
I'm
Um,
sure.
And centralized teams, they're experiencing just as much pain as, GTM analytics teams, right?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily comfortable in this state. Um, so it is a stakeholder engagement. It's about bringing everybody to the table and saying like, hey, we got all these problems. What is the solution? In previous experience, how we make decisions is essentially leadership. So we would be as data leaders experiencing our problems, and then we would talk to GTM analytics teams, talk about their problems, and ultimately it would be brought to like the VP of engineering,
Mm,
and they would kind of make plans and work with because it's also people like their area of domain. People don't necessarily like releasing control.
totally.
So that's why this federated model exists in the intermediary, where they don't actually release control, but you frame it as like, hey, it would be so much better if we actually worked and knew the business. So maybe the teams are centralized here, but in here, you're actually saying, hey, why don't you go attend those marketing meetings? Why don't you go attend those revenue meetings? Why don't you go attend the product meetings? And then you can separate leaders on each of these squads that you could call lead data analysts that basically help out with each of these, but they're managed centrally. So that's the first step is getting from centralized to federated. And then once you're federated and people are normalized in that state, then you start thinking about the data mesh structure, if that helps.
It does. It definitely feels very evolutionary. Another question for you here, Miles, kind of different than the last one. What have you found to be the most effective in teaching the data folks about go-to-market, it says here, like definitions, metrics, any like best practices you've seen?
I think the best thing that a data person can do is work in the actual model. So if you have a revenue model in your meaning layer, a data person can become an expert in a model. But in order to build a model in your meaning layer that powers your BI tools, like your self-service tools, they have to understand and speak to the stakeholders, speak to GTM analytics, speak to revenue leaders on how to construct the model.
Mhm.
So I would say they learn best through building and building the metrics within these models, but it also forces them to engage and be in meetings with revenue.
Yeah.
Um, so I would
Learning by
say,
doing. I can
was
understand
that?
that for sure. Learning
Oh
by
yeah,
doing. Just throw them in.
yeah, exactly. So it's and also just allow working with the leaders of the centralized data team and saying, hey, do you think it'd be really good for your data people to be part of our meetings?
Yeah.
I think it'd be great to have them and like they can learn by proxy and just part of your ceremony meetings, just to get that culture kind of stimulated.
Yeah, great. Miles, we're pretty much right on time here. This was awesome. I learned a lot. I think a lot of folks listening, I'm sure, learned a lot as well. Thank you so much for joining us, man. It was great.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
I'm sure if any folks listening, either now or on the recording, have any questions, I imagine Miles is open to answering them for you. He's been nothing but helpful to us at Account Name. And so you can also funnel questions towards me, and I'll kind of get them answered with Miles for you. Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody. Thanks, Miles.
Thank you. See you. Bye.